So this week we're continuing our series in Daniel called Life in Babylon. And first of all, I just want to say thanks to everybody kind of rolling with the punches last week. I was literally going to, I wasn't feeling well, but I was going to, thank you, I was going to power through. But then at the last minute, Megan's like, hey, you should take a COVID test. And I was like, oh yeah, that's still a thing. And I took a COVID test, and obviously it was positive. And so this last week has been a struggle for me because not only did I have to preach and record and post my sermon from last week, I had to get one ready for this week. So we're going to do a video this week, but I'll preach as well. It's, the video is going to do some lifting for me. But so the first week we did in Daniel, we talked about kind of the difference of what we need. What happens when we go to a new culture? Do we adapt or do we resist? Do we kind of bunker down and keep our old culture? And what we discovered was that God says no. You can be in both. You can be in God's kingdom. You can be in Babylon's kingdom as well. And then the next week, we talked about kind of, this is the one I put online, kind of like what are the idols that we worship? What are the things that distract us from worshiping God? And then this week, we're going to continue on. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 4. And this is a thick chapter. And so it was kind of a difficult one for me to study for because it's like an onion. It's got a lot of layers. There's just a lot going on here. And yes, Shrek. And so we've kind of talked about what does it mean when we resist Babylon. And today I want to talk about what does it mean when we embrace Babylon. What happens when we embrace the culture that we're in that gives us different commands and values than what God's kingdom is about. And so, but before we do that, we're gonna do a video. Joel, you want me to run the video, or you got it?
I got it.
You gotta go back.
Yeah. No, I definitely got it.
Okay. And this is from the Bible Project.
If you read the New Testament, you'll notice that the most common title people use to describe Jesus is the Christ. That is, the Messiah.
But surprisingly, Jesus almost never used that word to describe himself. Instead, he called himself the Son of Man.
The Son of Man. What does that mean?
Well, the phrase comes from an important chapter in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel was an Israelite prisoner of war who was forced to live in the empire of Babylon and work for the prideful, violent king who destroyed his home.
That sounds horrible.
And while he was living and working in Babylon, Daniel had this crazy prophetic dream. You ready for it?
I'm ready.
He saw 4 beasts crawling out of a dark sea, hybrid monster-like animals, each scarier than the one before. And the 4th beast is so mutant, there's nothing to compare it to. And it's violent, leaving death and destruction in its wake.
What in the world is this about?
Well, he's told that these beasts symbolize violent, prideful kings and their empires.
Oh, like the one Daniel's enslaved to.
Yeah, and these creatures might seem random to you, but these images are developing an important biblical theme. How humans are these remarkable creatures, capable of doing great good and horrible evil.
How we can behave like animals.
Right. Look at the first pages of the Bible. God creates the beasts of the field and humans together, all from the dust. But then the humans are set apart and given a royal task of being God's image.
So humans are like the animals, but called to become much more.
Yeah, they're to be God's representatives on earth, ruling on his behalf, like kings and queens. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast who says that they could be more than just God's partners.
Yeah, that they could rule the world on their own terms, which sounds good to them.
But God knows this will be a disaster. And so he expels the humans to the realm of the beasts.
The partnership is lost.
But God makes a promise that one day a human will be born who won't give in to the beast, Rather, he'll overcome and strike the beast while being struck by it.
Okay, so for the rest of the biblical story, we're waiting for that human. But instead, in story after story, we find people acting like beasts.
Yeah, like in the next story about Cain, who's jealous and angry at his brother Abel. God warns Cain that he's facing a beastly urge called sin, a dark, mysterious kind of evil that consumes humans. But God says that Cain can rule the beast if he chooses.
But he doesn't rule the beast. He lets this urge devour him, and he becomes a beast.
And then after this, Cain's children spread their animal-like violence, and it leads to the founding of a whole civilization known for its beastly pride, the city of Babylon.
Okay, Babylon. So fast forward, this is where Daniel is enslaved, having this bizarro dream.
Exactly. Now, watch what happens next in Daniel's dream. He sees into God's throne room where a court is set up, and God condemns the beast to destruction.
That's great.
And then Daniel sees that there's actually more than one divine throne.
Oh, right, the throne that humanity left behind.
Right. There hasn't been a human who's able to overcome the beast and rule alongside God until now. Daniel sees a figure called the Son of Man, which means a human. And he rides on a cloud up into God's presence and then sits down on the divine throne to rule the world.
The partnership's renewed.
Yes, and even more. All humanity worships and serves this Son of Man alongside God.
Oh, worship? So this is no ordinary human. This is like a God human.
Exactly. And so now you can see why Jesus of Nazareth, when he came onto the scene centuries later, chose this title, the Son of Man, for himself. He was claiming to be that truly human one on a mission to confront the beast.
He was tempted to seize power on the beast's terms.
But unlike every human before him, Jesus resisted the urge. And then he went about banishing the beast from people's lives, and he was teaching people how to rule the beast instead of being ruled by it.
Okay, so how do you rule the beast?
Well, Jesus did it by giving up his life.
Wait, rule the beast by dying?
Yes, when Jesus was on trial in a human courtroom and being condemned to death, he said, "From this moment on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at God's right hand and coming on the clouds."
But this is the moment he's about to die.
Exactly. From one perspective, the cross looks like a beastly torture device, but Jesus viewed it as his throne. And on this throne, he exposed the subhuman nature of our evil by letting it do its worst, and then he overcame it with his divine life and love. Jesus' execution was his exaltation.
So Jesus is the first human to overcome the beast, and as a result, he can partner with God to rule the world.
And so now, Jesus is summoning a new humanity into existence, one that can overcome the beast in the same paradoxical way.
To rule the beast by dying.
And then by discovering that Jesus' life and power can become our life and power. So we can rule the world as God's partners, but Jesus style, in the power of service, humility, and self-giving love.
Go to the next one.
That was good.
That's like the 5th time I've watched that this week.
I would like to look that up again later.
Yeah, I'll post it on the in the group later this week.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There were many profound things in there, but I'd like to point out that one of the monsters was unequivocally a Furby. Watch for it when you rewatch it
Furbies
again.
are freaky.
Yeah, one of them was a Furby, no doubt. It was like shortly after the humans got cast out, and it was one of the monsters getting cast out along with them. It was a Furby. I kept on looking to see if they repeated it. They did not. It's a one and done Furby. And also, I think that's absolutely on track, and they are safe.
I was just gonna say that's like the 5th or 6th time I've probably watched that in the last couple days, and I feel like I've learned something new every time. But one of the themes in Daniel that we haven't really touched on yet is this whole idea of dreams and being interpreted and dream interpretation. We skipped Daniel chapter 2, which is where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and Daniel comes and he interprets it. And then in this chapter as well, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has a dream as well. And Daniel's going to interpret that dream. And the dream, I'm just going to try to summarize it because it's pretty extensive. But he pictures a a humongous tree that basically, he says it touches the sky, and its branches cover the land, and everybody can see it. And there's fruit that comes from that tree, and it provides shelter for animals and for birds, and it is the most perfect tree there is. And then all of a sudden, it says a representative of God, of heaven, so an angel comes and cuts it down, and then kind of disperses the wealth of the tree, disperses the branches, the fruit, and then it says that tree is covered with bronze and iron, and for 7 years, it has this phrase, the dew of heaven hits it. And then all of a sudden, it recognizes that it has been destroyed and leans on God again. It's just this weird story that you're just like, what is going on? And in chapter 4, verse 20, it says, this is Daniel, he's interpreting the dream. He says, the tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. So Daniel's basically saying, hey, you're going to get to the point where your pride, your hubris has gotten to be so much, you're going to be cut down. And you're going to be made to go live with the animals and in the forest, and you're going to become you're going to become like a wild one. And then continuing on in verse 28, it says, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Picture that. What is he becoming? He's becoming a beast. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the power of heaven and the people of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me. For the glory of my kingdom, my advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So, I don't know about you, but for me, I read this story and I'd be like, because it talks about a year after Daniel has interpreted this dream, Nebuchadnezzar is basically walking around. He's like, "Look at this place. Aren't I awesome?" And I know for me, like when I read the story, I'm just like looking at like, dude, like literally Daniel just told you exactly what's going to happen, and you're going to get too big for your britches, and you're going to fall victim to pride, yeah, and hubris, and yet you still let it happen. I recognize that this story, like a lot of times, is something that it's easy for us to kind of judge the character in the Bible, but I know that this happens for me all the time. God's word constantly tells us about how we're going to sin and fall away from Jesus, and we're like, no, we're not going to do that. But yet every day we wake up and we choose to follow the ways of the beasts instead of the ways of heaven. And every day we think to ourselves, like, I'm not going to sin. I'm not going to be that person. But we find ourselves judging other people. We find ourselves gossiping behind other people's back. We find ourselves lusting after people we see on TV and movies. And we find ourselves just controlled with anger that we can't get out of. And yet, over and over and over again, we are told that this is what we're going to do. We have the pride and the hubris to say, "Oh God, that's not going to be me. I'm not going to be the one that falls victim to that." But over and over and over and over and over and over again, God, we do that and we become the beast little by little by little. And in verse 27, God gives us the answer. He tells us, this is what you do to not let that happen. Daniel says, "Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. So we have the answer. The answer is that when we need to recognize that we are not in control of our lives. In the same way in the video that Adam and Eve chose to define good and evil outside of God. We do that every single day. And what we need to do is we need to humble ourselves and look to God and say, "God, you are the Lord of our lives. Like it or not, we are not the center of the universe." Like it or not, we may be the center, we may be the hero in our own stories, but we are not the hero of the story that is humanity, that is the story of time. That hero is Jesus. And he says the way that we get away from doing that is that we love the outsiders and the oppressed. We serve those that basically Jesus would have served. We think about others before we think about ourselves, which as a human being is very hard to do. But the second we do that, and the second we recognize, like, God, you are Lord of my life, that's when he can begin to work in our lives. That's when we can begin to move away from the beast and letting the beast control ourselves. And I know this is kind of like a lot of kind of allegory and language of beasts and sin and stuff like that, but what it comes down to is when we learn to love others and think of others before we think of ourselves, and not only do that, but think of how we can serve others before we serve ourselves, that's when we can begin to truly be the human that Jesus, that we were made to be. Truly be the ones that God made us to be. Has anybody heard the story of Mother Teresa and her feet? So Mother Teresa, very famously, when she was in her 70s, 80s, had just horrible feet. She's like, they were just all crumpled up and just misfigured. And when the story goes, that somebody asked her, like, Mother, like, what happened to her feet? And they said basically the mission in Calcutta would get donated so many shoes a year, and every year she would let everybody else choose the best ones, and then she would come in and get the last ones. And then just after years and decades of choosing the worst shoes, her feet began to deform and became unrecognizable in so many different ways. After years of putting other people before her, she began to, her body physically changed. And I don't know about you, but that's a beautiful story of, like, I wish that I had the ability to love others that much, that my body began to be misshaped for Jesus.